ladies and gentlemen, dear friends and supporters of law as culture. You received the invitation card and might have a first impression of what might go on this evening and this night. I think for the general context we should remember that the political dimension of art becomes particularly apparent when artists deal with the topic of war and violence. It becomes more and more part of modern art, but we should not forget that images are produced that are often highly unsettling when we think, for example, of pictures done and images by Goya, Otto Dix and others. Pictures by Dix had been described as being awful, horrible, horrifying and so forth, and having nothing to do with art at all, because the beauty of the idea of art would have been hurt. And of course this remains a kind of a problem. How is it possible for aesthetically valid images of the horrors of war and violence to be created? So Tim Shaw, currently artist in residence at the Käthe Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, Law as Culture, you have intensively dealt with the motive of war and terrorism in recent years, as is reflected in many of your sculptures, for instance, Tank on Fire, as well as in installations such as Casting a Dark Democracy. Even the title is very horrifying. In your lecture, Black Smoke Rising, How Conflict Has Informed 10 Years of Art Practice, as part of the forum, you will offer us insights into your proper work and thereby illustrate the motivational power of conflict for the genesis of art. First of all, one has really to comment and to remark that a speaking artist is not the general figure we have in mind. You might remember Joseph Beuys in his ritualistic way to present just an animal in order to tell how to explain pictures just by talking to animals. And I hope very much that you are taking us as more as human beings. The joke doesn't work, doesn't matter, it's not so important. So it's too serious the topic, I see. Oh yes, it's very heavy loaded. We are in Germany and we are also, excuse me for that, and we are also in the midst of the art as the holiest of the holies. Okay, I understand. However, I have to present the sculpture Tim Shaw. He was born somewhere, but this time it is important where he has been born, in Belfast. As a sculptor and contemporary visual artist, he became later. You studied first at Manchester Polytechnic and then at
Falmouth, that's right, yeah.
Falmouth, and I have always difficulties in pronouncing this difficult word, where he received, and you received a first-class fine art degrees and so forth and so forth. What is interesting? A major public solo exhibition, Black Smoke Rising, toured to make Birmingham and Aberystwyth Arts Centre. During 2014, your work featured in Reflections of War at Flowers Gallery in London, and Back from the Front present Shock and Contemporary Artists at War and Peace at the Royal West of England Academy. You have undertaken a number of public commissions, including The Rites of Dionysus. This is very interesting to me. I would like to see and learn more about this, because one of the major books in the early 90s in French has been written by Michel Maffesoli in L'Ombre de Dionysos. And this has been a very important book about effervescence and a Durkheimian view on the world through the eyes and the lenses of the myth of Dionysus. The Minotaur for the Royal Opera House will be very familiar to most of you who like operas, I suppose. And there is also the drummer in Truro city centre. When I talk to friends about what our last evaluation procedures had been, I talked about it and I read it to some of you in terms of a battle after the battle. And then somebody told me, the warriors in the intellectual field, it's more the drummers who win. And so this would say that it is more about speaking and more about telling stories and more about taking people by a specific kind of emotions. So what might be interesting besides representations and exhibitions in Athens and other places in the world is the fact that you were elected to the Royal Academy in 2013, and you were elected a fellow to the Royal British Society of Sculptors and a fellow at Falmouth University. And currently you're active as an artist in residence at the Käthe Hamburger Center for Advanced Study in the Humanities, where you received the Georg Simmel Artist Stipend for your work on the topic, The Birth of Breakdown Club. But the topic today is Black Smoke Rising, how conflict has informed 10 years of art practice. I would have liked to add an anecdote how we met in London. It was a wonderful party, but this is swinging London, and we are much more serious now. Tim, I'm very glad and I'm very thankful to you that you came over to us, that you work with us with the fellow group, and that you invest such a lot of energy, not only in your artwork, but also to make those cold-hearted scientists more open to the flavor and the colors of the art. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you. I don't think I've ever been so well introduced. So it's a very fine one. I just want to start by really thanking. Well, actually, I want to start by saying never talk to strangers. In fact, and that is the opening title of a great book called The Master and Margarita by Mikhail Bulgakov. And that line was often reiterated by my mother, who said, never talk to strangers. But I'm actually very glad that I disobeyed, because last year at the Royal Academy, when I looked across the room and saw a rather interesting looking European man and learned man and a very interesting looking and very attractive young lady, I headed straight in the direction of, and subsequently, and as a consequence, I have arrived here. And after 12 weeks, or how many weeks, I just want to thank Professor Fenrir Gippard and Katja as well. Thank you for the invitation to this centre. And I want to thank all the fellows and co-workers and students who've all been really great. It's been a great fellowship around the table, and very, very deeply inspiring actually. A lot of my time is actually spent on my own. So it's good to come to the table, and it's good to think, and it's good to talk with very very well educated and well read and intelligent people. because I think what matters is the furthering of ideas, and that's hopefully feeds into everybody's work, and including my own. And then we go out into the world and decide what to do with that information. And hopefully by what we do, we try to change the world in some small way, or add to change. I think these things are really important. I want to start by just giving a little bit of background about myself, which is just going to be very brief. And I've actually, last year when I had these major solo shows across England, it was the first time that I ever put together a generic statement about my work after 25 years of working as a sculptor. That might sound quite odd, but I think it takes time to find out what it is you're trying to say through your work. I grew up in Belfast. I was born some time ago now, and I grew up during the 60s and 70s and 80s in a zone that's at the time didn't really know anything else other than what it was, but looking bad, it was a war zone, and people were being shot and blown up every day. But when you're very close to the situation, it's just all seems kind of normal. A strange sort of normality is what some chaps said of it. I got on a boat in 1984 and I ended up on the glamorous and exotic shores of England, where I studied in Manchester and then later on in Falmouth. And then I've worked across southern England in different places such as Bristol, Manchester and London. Anyway, a couple of paragraphs just to, as I say, generically talk about what I do, or what is important, and what's important in this particular work. It starts with, opens his statement, the need to shape and form material into something that expresses meaning and emotion is an instinctual one that fundamentally underpins my art practice. It is an activity that connects contemporary life with prehistoric existence. It mirrors the ideas and beliefs of humanity over thousands of years. And this is something that I find profoundly moving and important. In classical Greece, when priests entered the inner sanctum of the temple of Athena, they stood in front of the large statue in fear, believing that this contained the spirit of the Virgin Goddess. The idea that an artwork can contain inner life or numinous presence is something that I find appealing, because it is what engages and inspires our imagination. And to that effect, I want to open with this image. And this is something that I came across 2 years ago, or nearly 2 years ago, in the British Museum. And every so often, I think in life, we all have this experience where you come across a bit of music or a bit of writing, and it stops you in your tracks. You have a profound experience with it, and as was the case with this, it's called the lion-headed figure, or Lewin Minch, and has also been called Lewin Frau. I hope I'm pronouncing it right.
Yes.
And by coincidence, actually, I didn't realise this until recently, but it was found at the Stadelhofen cave in Hohenstein, and was discovered in 1939 and rediscovered 30 years later. And it's actually 40,000 years ago, so it's 40,000 years old, and stands at 30 centimetres. It's carved in mammoth ivory, And as I said, it was in this exhibition that I went to the British Museum, where I walked into the room, and it was almost as if feeling a presence, or like somebody stares at you from across the room, and you don't see the stare, but you feel the presence. And as I looked over, I saw this great piece of what probably now we call an artwork, and I walked up to it and looked through the glass cabinet, looked up and down the textured ivory and into the eyes of the lion head figure. And the eyes and the stare and the whole experience engaged my imagination, and it was like being absorbed in through this form into another place and another time. And that other place and other time was, of course, a very, very long time ago, 40,000 years ago. And as I stood there, I thought about this, and my mind sparked off all sorts of pictures and questions and thoughts about what was the person like that made the piece of work. What did they look like? What was going on in their head? And what afforded them the time to create such a thing at a time whenever men and women would have been out hunting and gathering? And what was the nature of this object? Was it a toy? Or was it a representation of a god or a goddess? What was the wind like that day that blew through the trees? These are the things that I pictured as I looked at this piece, and then came back to the present and went away quite silent. And the pictures stayed in my head. I suppose it's something that you could call like a trance vision. And these are probably some of the things that inspire me to make, and also help me to appreciate what I might consider to be great art, or something great within art. To that effect, this pile of axe heads are very old. I call them my friends, and they're my friends because I've visited them all my life in the Ulster Museum, from a kid right up to, in a couple of weeks' time, when I'll go back to Belfast and I'll go back to the museum. And it's just something that I like to go and look at. You wouldn't describe these objects as art per se, but they've got something to them, an inner presence and a power, and whatever that is, it connects us with the past. And this is what I'm talking about whenever I feel that creating art, and particularly sculpture, that has existed for a long time, it connects contemporary life, our lives today, with prehistoric existence. So really, that's the basis, my fundaments really in dealing with art practice. The title of the exhibition is Black Smoke Rising, the exhibition that I showed and toured last year, and the title obviously of this lecture. And perhaps there'll be several lectures given at some point along that title. These are the words that I muttered back in 2004 as I was returning to the city of Belfast after a weekend of being in a small town called Enniskillen. And as I was driving along the motorway into Belfast, I could see small pockets of smoke rising throughout the whole city, probably in all maybe 20, 25. And it was that type of smoke that was reminiscent of growing up during what became known as the Troubles in Northern Ireland. It was a heavy, dense, toxic smoke, and it was the type of scene that had a visceral effect on me, because it only spelled danger ahead. And so it was with this image that was handed to me actually on the 30th of April 2004, and it had the same sort of visceral effect. And I was handed this newspaper. It was on the front of the Daily Mail, in fact. And I just stood and stared at it for quite some time, and then put it on the studio wall, where it stayed for quite a long time as well. And the moment that I saw this, I not only felt compelled to create and dedicate quite a bit of time to creating a piece of work about this image, but it was an image that, for me, represented at that time everything that was wrong about our government's decision to go to war with America in Iraq. A war that, if not illegal, certainly has been a very controversial one and has had terrible consequences. So the image itself, as I'm sure you know, is one of 279 images that come from the Abu Ghraib torture scandal, whenever the US Marines tortured the prison inmates. So there's 271 images and 19 videos that were produced by the soldiers of torture scenes. And this is by no means, certainly by no means the most gruesome of the images produced. But what it is certainly profoundly intriguing, because it seems to resonate through time and place and religion, reminding us of something else that has existed down through the centuries. And we see it echoed in the Spanish penitence on Semana Santa each year, and you see it echoed through the paintings in particular of Goya, of the penitents, and also further back to 3rd century BC, I came across these two minute and very beautiful sculptures that echoed the same sort of hooded and cloaked shape of the Abu Ghraib figure. Obviously it had a different intention and expression, or these have a different intention and expression to that of the Abu Ghraib hooded figure. But there's a similarity, visual similarity about it. These are images of Telesphores, which is a child deity figure in Athens Agora, ancient Agora. And lastly, and this is something that's been mentioned time and time again, the figure has this vulnerability, like a Christ-like vulnerability, with the hands held out. And in particular, I came across this image last night on Google and thought, it's so similar. So this image is something that I feel is steeped within the psyche of humanity. And I've just wrote out a small description about this, belonging to no particular age or place. It is reminiscent of something that could have been dug out of the earth from long ago. Barbaric and menacing in appearance, it also possesses a Christ-like vulnerability. Interestingly, the image that is so iconic of the Iraq War transcends it. The image remains potent as something that trawls just beneath the surface of the collective consciousness, revealing to us our primitive instincts. So with that, I at the time I was actually working. At the time that this image was published, I was working on a major project for the Eden project, and coming to a close in that. And then I was invited to the very west of Ireland to work on a residency over there. So I had a mind full of ideas to do with the prospect of war in Iraq. I arrived in the very west of Ireland, and for 2 days I didn't really know what to do with myself, and I think I may have just stood and stared out of the window and got extremely anxious about the passing of time, and the whole sort of guilt work thing that I'm sure you all experience from time to time as you're falling asleep in your studios or wherever. As I was looking through the window, I began to notice bits of black plastic snagged on barbed wire and on fences and in the trees. And it's the sort of black plastic. I haven't seen it here in Germany yet, but certainly in the UK and Ireland, it's an agricultural plastic that wraps bales of hay. And it finds its way certainly across the landscape of the UK and Ireland, and as the wind blows, it causes this sort of slightly phantom-like imagery, and as I was staring out of the window, becoming anxious, I was starting to notice that I was asking myself, were these birds, were these crows and rooks, or were they black plastic? And so I started to play with this idea of black plastic looking like rooks and crows looking like black plastic. And I went out into the landscape, collected lots of black plastic and straw, and began creating what was the first rook. And then another one was created, and then I returned to my studio in England and created 25, and then made an office space which was painted white, and put into it office equipment and dishevelled it so that the whole office was sort of chaotically furnished, let's say. Put computers in there, and this piece became known as Parliament, because Parliament is the collective term for a parliament of rooks. I don't know what it is in German, but I'd like to know afterwards, actually. So we've got a parliament of rooks and a murder of crows and an unkindness of ravens. And I notice that just outside the door every morning there's 2 wonderful crows to meet, certainly myself, and I'm sure that happens to you too. So I created this piece, and the reason also it's called Parliament, whilst I was making the piece, this particular piece, I was also focusing in at night on what was happening in Parliament. In England we've got a station, it's called Radio 4, and there's a programme that's called Today in Parliament, and basically it is the highlights of what the parliamentarians have been saying during the day. And as I started to sort of hold my ears back like this, it seemed to me that the distinction between the cries of rooks and the parliamentarians started to merge. So I created this soundscape where I was able to get extracts from what they were saying in Parliament and merging it with the cries of rooks. What's interesting about this is that it can always remain kind of ancient but contemporary, because you can always merge the very latest issues that are being discussed in Parliament, and so it was very interesting to bring certain sound bites into the mix and to merge it all. And it was quite interesting as I was going through quite a lot of files that I came across an extract from the Reverend Ian Paisley, who was very important in Northern Irish politics. And after many years, he came out with this line that something came into the hearts of the people. So all of these things informed and came into the work. And when I showed this piece in Northern Ireland, I invited my mother along, and I was talking to somebody across the room. It was in a room, a specially made room, and one of the exhibition attendants came across and notified me to say that my mother was clearing up the room in the installation room. So I walked into the room, and because there was papers everywhere, my mother said, "This room is a mess." she was quite elderly at the time, so so that's really just sort of brief introduction to the materials that I like to use. So I began employing the black baleen plastic in what was to be the maquette of Casting a Dark Democracy. And so the piece, the small model, it's only about that size, is created out of welded steel, barbed wire, and black plastic. And the barbed wire and the black plastic work well together because you can sort of model and stretch it over the barbed wire. And barbed wire is something that everybody in Northern Ireland, certainly in the 70s, grew up with, because everywhere you went there were roadblocks and barbed wire and all of that, and a lot of glass as well. So you're probably wondering what the hell is what has Greece got to do with it? That's in fact quite a bit. I had a residency in Athens both last year and in 2004, and the Parthenon always intrigued me, and I would go and draw it every day for about 30 days. And I used to think about long ago when the temples entered the inner sanctum, and as I said to you, that there was this huge 40-foot statue in there, and the priests would look and stand in fear, believing that the spirit of Athena lived within the ivory, the gold, and the marble of the statue. And so, thinking about these things, I thought that my figure, Casting a Dark Democracy, had to have this presence. It had to be bigger than a human. Not that I don't want to say that something small or small objects don't have presences. Of course they do, but it felt to me that this was this monster, if you like, or the shape of things to come and things that have been already. It just felt to me that this object needed to be quite large, and I created it to a height of 5.5 meters, which is pretty close to 18 foot. This is not the studio that I made it in, but this is, and I was invited to London to work at the Kenneth Armitage Foundation, Kenneth Armitage was particularly well known in the 50s and the 60s as one of England's best celebrated sculptors. When he died, he left behind a legacy whereby a sculptor would come and work in his studio and house for 2 years. The studio was 25 foot high, so it gives you an idea of what a great gift and privilege that was to have that experience. It was probably one of the greatest studios you could ever have in London. That said, I haven't been to Gormley's or Anish Kapoor's, so anyway, I made many pieces there, but this was the principal piece, and it was sort of made in this environment, and the figure as it developed changed into an installation, and as you can see, there's the reflection that you see in the floor is actually sump oil, old engine oil, because of course we all know that the casting of a democracy in Iraq was very much to do with oil. So it just felt right that the shadow should be cast across the room, and so the figure is 5.5 meters, and the shadow is cast across a bit longer than the figure. And as you can see, the floor has sand. It is covered with sand throughout the whole floor, and that references the Middle East, and then the walls have smeared onto them certain words, which I'll talk about in a minute. This photograph is a lie. It's quite a well-known photograph, but it's actually a lie to what is actually there in the room, and I'm going to actually play a little bit of film footage now. But for the purposes of taking a photograph, it seemed at the time the right thing to do, but in reality the room is only illuminated by a single 30-watt light bulb, and a haze fills the room, so that you get this effect of solid air and sort of a slight smoking. So in a sense it plays upon the idea of illusion and the idea of political smokescreen. And of course this is another thing that became very particular to the decision to go to war with respect to the weapons of mass destruction. So I just thought I would add a few images of the details. So from afar, it looks like quite a solid, large, heavy form, but actually, when you get close to it, it's all ripped open, and it's hollow, so that you look into it, and you look into emptiness. And this is the first time that I came across the idea of looking into the space and just saying dark space, and that's where the imagination starts to work. I believe that the monsters are out there, but the greatest monsters are within the imagination. So I used these materials, such as barbed wire and steel and black plastic, because I felt that they seemed to be sympathetic to the brutality of the image. And I, at that time, I met a builder that had lots of three-phase electrical wire, and I asked him, could I have all of it? So he said that he very kindly gave it to me. And also this was something that seemed really fitting, because if you know the story of the torture victim, the wires were put into his hands, he was blindfolded and told that if he fell off the box, there was a pool of water below, and that the live wire would travel through and he would be electrocuted. So it seems that the idea of having modelling the feet and the legs in three-phase wire seemed to be appropriate for the work. And as it said, that certainly on this first installation that I did, I smeared the walls with oil. I'll probably never do that, make that mistake again, because and if there's something that I can give to you tonight, never smear black used engine oil on walls, because it's very, very difficult to get rid of. It probably took about 6 attempts of paint. Anyway, the words written are, "This is your fucking zeitgeist," and Demos Kratos, people power, where is it? And it was written, the dollar sign came up. It was written it's in the dollar, people power. That's what it was referring to. So that's original. That first install was created and first shown on October the 1st, 2008. Damien Hirst had his first major solo show with Christie's, and then came the crisis, which was bubbling already. So it was a very particular time. Moving on from that, when I was invited last year by Mac Birmingham and Aberystwyth Arts Centre to put together a solo exhibition, and they wanted to show these pieces, it seemed right to show Casting a Dark Democracy, because it didn't feel old work, and it felt that, if anything, that its relevance was growing acutely. And what it did give me the chance to do is to rethink and absorb where to go next with it. And this is what I tend to do with my work, and you're probably very aware of this, that I tend to change things as I go along. It's probably no different for you when you're writing, that it's first draft, second draft. So I began to think about the oil pool and felt that I needed to get away from it being the shape of the figure. It needed to open up and belong to timelessness, in a sense. Certainly it needed to open up this sense of the ancient and the present and the future. And by one way of doing this, I thought what I would do is create a rectangular pool. So I started looking at Arabic pools, and as I was doing so, somehow my mind ended up going several thousand miles across to Washington, and I felt, when I saw this image for the first time, I saw the figure where the obelisk is there, and it seemed to me that if there was ever to be a memorial about late 20th century and early 21st century democracy, perhaps this should be it. And so I brought about I created this oil pool, which was 30 foot, 10 meters long, and I felt that it did do what I set out to achieve, and that was to create a memorial of a casting of a dark democracy. And the interesting effect that it had was that you could now see the whole figure reflected in there. And when you walk up to the actual oil pool, that reflection about democracy goes very, very deep, and you almost feel as if you're falling into this abyss. There's a figure, somebody standing next to it, to give you an idea of the scale, and that's it without the figure. And sump oil, or used engine oil, is a really beautiful material to use, because there's nothing like it. It's thick, it's dense, and it reflects things absolutely perfectly, flawlessly. It also has a smell of danger, and that's also very important with the work. And when I first showed the piece at the Kenneth Armitage Foundation, I probably spent 2 nights not sleeping, thinking the place is going to blow up. So, but it didn't. And there's not many people that produce oil pools. I can think of one other person. So I'm just going to play a very short excerpt of what the actual installation is. So that was just to give you a very basic idea that the actual sound is produced through valve technology, so it actually vibrates the whole room. And the concept behind the sound was to do with the drum beat and the heartbeat, and that came from whenever I brought the first barrel of oil in to the studio, and my assistant and myself undid the top of the barrel, and as we were leaning over into the oil pool, and this was a really heavy object, it could have broken your leg if things had gone wrong. The oil started to come up, started to pour out slowly, and as it poured out, and I'd never had this is the first time I'd ever done this, it poured across the surface of the oil pool, showing for the first time very slowly the reflection of the figure. And as it was doing that, this glug, glug, glug was happening, and it reminded me, it was a precious sound in that it was like a soft drum beat. It's like a heartbeat, and the drums obviously are very important things that go back to the beginning of time. So it felt that this thing that was about the loss and gain of land and of power, it seemed important that the drum beat had to be part of this. At that time, I was making other works, and this is another image that I saw, that I noted and kept on the studio wall, and I found it very terrifying and intriguing as well. And most things that do terrify or intrigue or stay in my mind, I need to work about somehow. And so I began creating this piece called Tank on Fire, and it's quite a small piece of work. And as I started it, I went to the army barracks in Somerset, where I visited some of the young lads there that had gone off to fight in Iraq, as I felt that it's important to try and research as deeply as you can. So I spent half a day with them and listening to the stories, and then came away and carried on with making this piece of work. And that visit to the barracks gave me a greater understanding of that image. But what I did feel as I was making this, I was asking myself, who's the terrorist here? Who's the victim? Who's the attacker? It produced within me a whole mixture of feelings. That I was looking into the eyes of these young boys, actually, these young kids, and these were the young kids that were walking the streets of Belfast with guns, needing to make split-second decisions. These are the guys that are, have joined up in the army and go off to fight a war, and in doing so, some of which don't come back alive. And my view on this is very mixed, in that I fully understand and appreciate that we need soldiers, and but I was able to see two sides of the versions. I can understand the people that were rioting and were throwing petrol bombs at the tank, and I can empathise with the fate of the soldier, who actually, there was 5 of them and they all survived. One of them in particular had to go through 10 years of operations to lead a normal life. Around the time of making the Tank on Fire, I was working on another piece called Man on Fire. And as I was making this piece, this attack happened in Glasgow Airport in 2007, where these 2 guys had driven into the front of the airport, I think with gas canisters in the car. So, it would have had to been able to breach right through the security barriers, would have caused absolute hell and mayhem. they didn't manage to, and this is one of the guys that was being hosed down afterwards, or during it, in fact. And it's the stuff of nightmares, really, and you feel very angry about what has happened and the intent behind it, but you understand also, these guys were doctors and religious people. They didn't take this decision lightly, and of course it was to do with what we were doing in Iraq. It doesn't none of these things just come out of the blue, as we all know. So I created this piece called Man on Fire, and this was the smaller version of it. It was hypothetical idea for the 4th plinth in Piccadilly, because I felt that at that time society was really falling into the great abyss, not only with the beginning of the recession, but in what we were doing across the world. I was also thinking about how God is used to bolster and justify violence, and so I wrote in the front of this, what God of love inspires such hate in the hearts of men, because we are preached that the God is the God of love, and how does it transform for that into God is behind us as we blow apart other people. And I poured oil over it again. This is the God that perhaps has a lot to be responsible for. This is the large version, which is on show at the Royal Academy at the moment, and probably the worst sort of display that I've ever seen. But anyway, there we go. I decided to create a larger version of it. It's about 4 meters high and 4 meters long. It's a very large piece of work. And as with a lot of my work, it doesn't just deal with the present. It actually is about the things that are timeless. And The Man on Fire, after a lot of thought, I wrote a statement, and the first line is, Man on Fire is about terror. And it's about the terror of losing one's life and lunging forward into the dreadful unknown. So it's monumental in scale and captures the dreadful moments of a person who is on fire, caught between a place of life and death, consumed by flames. The body lunges uncontrollably forward as one horrifying mass. During the making of the piece, I visited Pompeii, and I was reminded of humanity's fate in the last dying moments, and that particular part of the mind that thinks and imagines what is beyond those last moments. And in Pompeii, in the museum, there are a collection of these wonderful figures, very haunting, and where the ash has fallen down on the town of Pompeii, covered it and covered the people. And what the ash did through time is it compressed, and obviously the person that was underneath the ash, they were moulded, and these moulds were created, and they were filled with plaster, and this gave the impressions of their last moments. So in a sense they were frozen in time, and as I say, quite haunting images. The third piece that I created for Black Smoke Rising, it's called Soul Snatched to Possession, and it began really with a scream in the middle of the night, in London. And I'm not sure whether that scream was actual or whether it was within my mind. But I woke up in the middle of the night and I looked out the window and thought about, what had happened. There was nothing else that was to be seen or heard. I stood at the window a few minutes and then went back to bed and thought, well, I'm not sure whether this was real or not. And in the morning it did disturb me a bit. I went to the local newspaper shop and inquired, and there was no news or anything. So it remains as the scream in the night. It had a particular resonance for me. At the time I was showing Casting a Dark Democracy, and the work was attracting quite a lot of attention from very powerful people in the art world. And I was starting to enter a world that I wasn't entirely happy with. It felt as if it was a world where truth was being manipulated, and I was having to listen to things that weren't true, that in terms of trying to sell things, that truth became a fabric, and it was being twisted and turned, being able to reach certain goals. And perhaps this was something to do with the scream in the night. So I created this maquette made up of 8 figures, and I decided that what I wanted to do was create this installation room where 8 larger than life size figures would be assembled in a room, and they would be crowding in on one victim and doing something to another. And in certain places you wouldn't know, who was complicit, and there was no weapons, there was no knife, but everything was implied, and I became very interested in this. And I began to use old clothes that I used to pick up off the streets at night and across London, and I would go to charity shops and use these clothes. And as I was beginning to work with clothes, I started to think about the history of the people that had worn them. And it was a medium that started to come alive and feel so fitting for this piece of work that I created. And the piece of work, as I've said, it's I'm just going to read an extract from something that I wrote. Influenced by violence disturbance that may or may not have been taken place in the streets of London, Soul Snatcher possession sets the scene of a ritual gangland killing, a punishment beating. No weapons are visible. The perpetrator's smile and gestures betray the moment just before some dreadful act is committed, where fear fills the imagination. The installation is a metaphor for the violent extraction of soul, the manipulation of mind, or the taking of life by the powerful in order to perpetuate the myth that those with the power want to portray. It relates to the street, the corridor of governance, and to commerce, and the art world is not excluded from this. And just to surmise, really what it is about is a dimension of barbarity that does not disappear from human nature. And as I was making the piece, certain things would come to mind very powerfully about if you were in that situation. What do you think about? You think about silly things like people's shoes and shoelaces and the cut of somebody's hair. And as I've said, in some areas of this work, you don't know whether something is complicit, the situation is complicit, or whether it is an act of overpowering. And this particular piece, it's called The Blind Whistler, and it's inspired by one day out in London. I descended the staircase of the Green Park tube station, and I could hear the sound of somebody whistling, and it seemed very unusual. And as I descended down, here was this very large figure whistling with his blind stick, and it was a scene that really struck my mind, because he was in his own world, whistling to the people that were passing him by, and it seemed as if there was two different worlds there at once. And I actually asked him. I managed to track a contact for him down through London Transport, and I asked if I could draw him, and I told him a bit about the work, and I never heard from him again, and so I sort of assumed that he wouldn't want to he didn't want to sit for me. But I felt that this figure needed to be, and the blind whistler needed to be witness to this soul snatcher possession that was taking place. And about a year after meeting the work, I met him again in the same tube station, and I wasn't sure what to say to him, so I just stood there and listened to him whistling, and looked and wondered, was he aware that somebody was there standing beside him? And then I felt a little bit bad that, that I'd, in a sense, that I'd made him part of this piece of work. So it was just a very unusual situation. And I think what I'm trying to say is that, what takes place as you pass people by, everybody has their own story and their own world, and you don't know anything about it. Right, this is the last piece. This time's going on. 22nd of July 1972 was the day that 19 bombs were let off in the centre of Belfast within 80 minutes, within a very close area. And some have said that it was 22, and some have said it was 26, but I think it's more accurately 19. And it caused absolute mayhem. Only 11 people were killed and 130 injured. It was a horrifying thing that happened, and strangely, the way that history has been rewritten or has evolved, it's almost been written out and forgotten about. And something that I listened to recently on the radio was a Northern Irish journalist being interviewed about 1972, and it was introduced as the programme was introduced as 1972, the year of Bloody Sunday, when the British troops opened fire on a civil rights demonstration, killing 13 or 14 people, which was a dreadful act of aggression by the British authorities. But somehow, half a year on from that, this other event that took place, that to my mind was immensely horrific, seems to be somehow overshadowed by this other event, and it's been in my mind for many years to create a piece of work about it. And I was invited last year to Athens, where I began the blueprint for it, and it's a piece of work that I will hopefully be showing quite soon. I may show it, in fact, this autumn in Northern Ireland. A decision to that effect needs to be made quite soon. It's a piece that obviously has a very, very sort of deep resonance for me, but also for the people of Northern Ireland. Because although it's been overshadowed by, and people move on from these situations because they need to and have to. Somehow I felt I needed to make the piece because I needed to in some way memorialise the victims, the people that were killed and injured that day, and the fact that this event actually happened and should not be ignored. And it's still a situation that is quite dangerous, and showing it will be certainly not very easy. And I have been told by a few people that to be careful. Nevertheless, I think that it will be shown. Anyway, I was a kid of 7, and I went to town that day with my mother, and we were in a restaurant, and 2 bombs went off, and then a third, and smoke started to rise up the staircase, and this blue air started to push across the atmosphere of the restaurant, and trays spun through the air, and it was almost as if people dissolved into shadows, running like panicked animals one way and another, then another. I think everybody got out fine. And it's only recently that I've managed to, actually talk to people about the situation. Like many, we tend to bury things. This event in the restaurant may have actually happened the year before, in which case the restaurant was a different time, and the Bloody Friday occasion was separate to that. But I want to condense it into one piece about that particular time. So this is the installation that I created for the Kapatos Gallery in Athens, and a special room was made within the gallery, and in the room are tables and chairs and old clothes and old shoes that are strewn across the floor, and these trays spin slowly through the air, and as they spin slowly through the air, shadows onto walls move in slow motion as they run down the walls, and then it's brought together by this very intense sound, the sound of many sirens. And that sound is inspired is actually the wrong word to use, influenced by a bit of footage that I was able to come across recently off that day. And when I heard the sound, it resonated very deeply, and I felt that this sound needed to be in the piece of work. And I think the piece of work, it's not about Northern Ireland, it looks out towards what's happening in the Middle East on a greater scale, because obviously homemade bombs have developed quite immensely, sadly. And that experience was obviously horrific, but this is something that continues every day in places such as Syria and Iraq, and it's the victims that are the ones that lose out from political decisions that are made from those in power in very complex situations, of course. So I'm just going to play a bit of footage from that. All right. Now, I'm just going to finish now with this last bit of film, and which is actually not about war. So I think we need to absolve ourselves of probably things that I've shown you today. This is a piece. I'm always thinking about, especially in our discussions that we have here, about what constitutes a good work of art. And damn me, but I can't put it into words. I find it quite difficult. I think I would need to sit down for months and try to analyse it before I put it into words. But what I would say is it's something that engages our minds, either intellectually or pictorially or both, all of those things, and makes us think, inspires thought about, who we are, where we've come from, where we're going. And sometimes when I look up at the stars at night and look into the endlessness of space, I feel very comforted by that great mystery. And when I went a month ago now, actually, to ZKM in a place called Karlsruhe, I had a really wonderful experience there. It was a great conference called Global, and it had very remarkable speakers there. And it also had some great artwork. And this is one of the pieces, and it's by composer, so I'm told, Ryoki Ikeda, and the piece is called Micro, and it's very inspired by a residency that he had, or she, because I don't know the sex of this person yet. I should do, but I don't. And it's, when I walked into this space, I looked at it for half an hour, and I left, and I came back for another half hour. And as I looked at it, it gave me that same feeling that I feel when I look up to a clear sky at night and look into the endlessness. And this piece is made up of many different things, very primal things. But one of the things is it's made up of numbers that float around in space, many, an infinite of numbers. And so I want to leave you with this. And but before I do, I just want to read this talk. This is a gift. It's a gift from George Orwell. And George didn't mince his words, but it's a gift to all makers, really. It's particularly addressed to writers, but I think it's addressed to all of us. And I picked this up in a shop, and I've already read 1984. I don't know whether you have, but it's something that I think everybody within the field that we're working in should actually read. In fact, I think it should be compulsory. So written on the back is a wonderful quote, and it goes, "The great enemy of clear language is insincerity. When there is a gap between one's real and one's declared aims, one turns, as it were, instinctively to exhausted idioms, like a cuttlefish squirting out ink. In our age, there is no such thing as keeping out of politics. All issues are political issues, and politics itself is a mass of lies, evasions, folly, hatred, and schizophrenia. When the general atmosphere is bad, language must suffer." Interesting food for thought, I thought. So I'm going to leave you with this wonderful piece of very badly filmed, because it was filmed by me. But there we go.
working on it.
Absolutely further on the one side.
It's not
There.
okay.
Not to worry. I think it's something that has to lie within the imagination of everybody. It often happens, I think, what I would say, I suppose part of the reason for showing this is I think it's really worth going to ZKM to see, to visit the place. It's a wonderful place, and it's very relevant to what we're working about here. That's all. Thank you.